I think leading through a crisis is something that you don't know how you're going to go until you're in the middle of it. And I certainly think that every leader, and when I talk about leaders, I believe every single one of us is a leader, whether you're leading your family, your community, a business, your country, whatever it is. We all lead others in different ways, and we're all role models. I think for being a leader through this crisis, there's a lot more complexity, and there's a real need to draw on those emotional intelligence skills and to really be able to show empathy and to understand what's going on in the lives of those that you're leading. I've been really fortunate that the leadership experience I've had has been incredibly diverse. So I started leading others in the military, which is one style and culture. I then went into leading lawyers in professional services, which is a whole nother kind of culture. And then as a CEO, I was leading largely psychologists all around the world. And so being able to adapt your leadership style, I think, is incredibly important, and it brings around different role models that you might want to draw on. I've been fascinated though watching leaders emerge through this crisis, and all of us as leaders are really setting our legacy every single day, because how we act during this crisis is really what we're going to be remembered for. These are three leaders that have really stood out for me. The first is Arne Sorensen, and I'm not sure if anyone watching has heard of Arne. He's the CEO of Marriott International. He gave a 5-minute speech that you can find on LinkedIn to all of his 100,000 or so Marriott staff around the world, right at the beginning of the crisis. And it's incredibly candid, humble speech. He's very vulnerable, he gets emotional, yet he balances that with this real decisive path forward, and he gives all of the people that he's leading this real sense of reassurance that they're going to see this crisis through. And I think being able to be a resolute leader and a courageous leader, yet combining that with these extreme levels of transparency, which is particularly important right now, with emotional intelligence, is a perfect example of the Stocktale paradox. And many people listening who have read Jim Collins's book might be aware of the Stocktale paradox, but it's something that we particularly need right now when people are struggling and they don't know what the future holds. And just briefly to explain that, Admiral Jim Stocktale, he was the most senior American military officer who was a prisoner of war in the infamous Hanoi Hilton during the Vietnam War. And he famously said how you must never confuse faith that you'll prevail in the end, which you can't afford to lose, with the discipline to confront the most brutal facts of your current reality, whatever they might be. And Jim Collins came to coin the Stocktale paradox. And the reason I mention it and link it with Arne Sorensen is because what he did and what we as leaders need to do is somehow balance at the same time these two competing notions, that you retain faith that you'll prevail in the end, so you've got a real sureness of success, while at the same time confronting the brutal facts of your situation, whatever it might be. And that's not easy, but it is incredibly important to earn that trust of people who are following you. Just briefly, two other leaders to mention: Adam Silver, who's the commissioner of the NBA. Now, if everyone thinks back to the start of this crisis, when the NBA season was suspended, that choice was made very early on. It was made before COVID had been known to enter the US. It was largely something we were looking at that was obviously in China, and I think at the time it had entered Italy. But he made that decision in the face of what now was a very good decision, but he would have had very little information. He wouldn't have known what was going to happen in the US, and he would have had any number of stakeholders counselling him against making such a radical financial decision without all of the information. So I mention him because he showed a real courage to make a decision without waiting to see what happened. And then the third person is Jacinda Ardern, the New Zealand Prime Minister. And the reason I mention her is she shows this incredible adaptability in her leadership. You'll often see her at the podium really strongly and stridently making decisions for the safety of New Zealand. New Zealand was one of the first to go into lockdown. They've had one of the strictest lockdowns. But then she's also prepared to flip that and to be incredibly authentic. And a recent example was a Facebook Live session she did sitting on her couch in her sweatpants, having just put her toddler to bed, and she took questions from the New Zealand public. And that kind of confidence and being able to comfortably adapt your leadership style without any loss of respect, and in fact it earns that authenticity and transparency, earns respect, I think has been another really endearing and important lesson from leaders during this crisis. One of my aspirations that I look to work for, and that's what I try and work with people on, is being an emotionally intelligent leader. You can have all the intellect in the world. I've got endless degrees. None of that means anything, really, if you don't know how to connect with people. And intellect can be learnt. We all learn a new industry or a new trade or whatever it might be. Having the emotional intelligence to actually really be able to bring people together and inspire them when they're feeling anxious, to embrace their ideas when you might not be sure if they're the right ones, being able to put ego to the side, all of that is difficult. But if you're emotionally intelligent, and that's why I think it's the most important skill for leaders, you can adapt your style to whatever the situation might be. It can be a pandemic, or it can be just having to reduce the size of an organization, or it can be expanding the size of an organization. If you are someone who is prepared to hear feedback, to ask for advice, to be vulnerable in saying you don't have all the answers, but I know you, Cami, I've hired you because you are the best person in the world to advise me on whatever it might be, you can't help but come up with a better outcome than taking all of that on yourself. I don't think that's a leader's role. I think a leader's role is to be like the conductor of an orchestra, and to be making sure that you are really embracing the skills, the diverse skills, ideally, that you have around you, and getting all of those people to feel safe to be able to give you their ideas, to help find solutions with you, to be able to be vulnerable in the sense, and again, you've got to be self-aware. Vulnerable doesn't mean me speaking in front of my 100,000 people like Arne Sorensen and crying and saying, I have no idea how we're going to get through this. That is not being a helpful, vulnerable leader. Vulnerable in his sense was when he was talking about having to stand down tens of thousands of staff. He spoke about how painful that was, because it went against his values, it went against the purpose of the company. It was really being able to link decisions you're making to a very human response. And I think everything we're talking about now is about being a very human leader, and leading in a way that doesn't just think of people as a resource, but actually thinks of them as someone who needs nurturing and needs to be able to feel that they're contributing to be able to help succeed.